pirates attacked them. The Danes occupied them. The Americans bought them. And today, from all over the world, people come to the Virgin Islands to relax and enjoy a way of life of times past. Traditional buildings produced by long-standing cultural traditions are rapidly disappearing and being replaced by modern structures that are to an alarming degree culturally and environmentally unrelated to West Indian architecture. This rapid growth of recent years, brought about by economic prosperity and the introduction of modern building materials such as concrete, is threatening the very existence of traditional architecture in the Virgin Islands. Join us while we explore the buildings of lingering cultures, the origins and development of the West Indian wooden cottage. Historians in the past have tended to emphasize the monumental buildings of cultures. In our case, these monumental structures are exemplified by the forts, great houses, and churches, which were designed by architects and engineers who were influenced by European architectural traditions. And yet, when we looked around us in the Virgin Islands, we see that the majority of the structures left behind by past generations are not monumental buildings, but everyday buildings, shops and homes which were, to a large degree, built by Afro-West Indians. This heritage constitutes much of the vernacular architecture of the Virgin Islands. This is not to say that these buildings are not without European and indeed American influence. However, it is the Afro-West Indian culture which is for the most part responsible for this segment of our picturesque architectural environment. The earliest recorded forms of architecture in the islands were crude temporary huts consisting of little more than forked poles driven into the earth and covered with thatched roofs and walls. Historical records reveal that both the Africans and Europeans who first settled here in the 17th century lived in these simple dwellings, which could be readily fashioned from materials found in the tropical environment. It is here in Coral Bay on the eastern end of St. John that we find today examples of one of the earliest forms of building in the Virgin Islands, the wattle and daub house.
I'm Guy Benjamin, a native of Coral Bay and Eastern and St. John. We are talking with Mr. Winfield James in Coral Bay this morning about the building of wattle houses. Mr. James is 94 years old.
92.
92. Thank you, Mr. James. And he knows all about the building of this house because he made it all by himself. He's also helped to build other wattle houses around Coral Bay. And he has seen wattle houses that were even 30 feet long. Mr. Winfield, can you tell us how you built the wattle house?
Yeah, I put the post them up and then I cut the wattle end from one to the other, I tell you, 7 feet apart.
Okay, you put the poles up.
Yeah, put land them in the earth.
And you planted them in the earth, or you cut them to the proper lengths?
Yeah.
Yes. And that was how many feet you said?
About 7 feet.
About 7 feet long.
Yeah.
Okay, you planted them one in, one out.
Yeah.
Right. Now, what did you use after you finished wattling the house, after you put the strips around it?
Well, I mix the mortar now.
Oh, you mix mortar?
Yeah, cement and sand.
Cement and sand, fine.
And mix it and then you plaster it.
I see.
Plaster for the interior and exterior walls was traditionally made from a mixture of quicklime, sand, and water. Lime was made by burning coral in a lime kiln. This 1843 sketch of Coral Bay shows lime kilns under construction along the shore. Mr. Benjamin remembers his grandfather's lime kilns on St. John.
I generally looked at a lime kiln as a work of art. I never thought of it as something from which you worked and from which you made a living. But I remember my grandfather making lime kilns when I was a small boy over in East End. Then he would start by putting a layer of stones, these white limestones, coral really, and then a row of wood. And he would build up a row of stones, a row of sticks, a row of stones, a row of sticks. And in the middle, he would have a central core. That would be made entirely of sticks. And he would go up until he got about 8 or 9 feet high. Sticks and stones, sticks and stones. Then he would light his kiln, his lime kiln, most likely from the top. I think they did it sometimes from the bottom, but it would be lit from those sticks that were placed in the center as the core. After it was lit, it would burn. And as it burned, he would pour water into this kiln. And it is the water on the limestones and the sticks that actually became the product lime, which was sold in St. Thomas or St. Croix, taken by his own boat, the Adventure, on these trips wherever he went.
Early wattle houses had thatched roofs before the use of corrugated tin became popular. The roof structure was made of long poles with the thatch literally sewn to the rafters with long wooden needles. The house was generally rectangular in shape, with the length twice the width and measuring approximately 12 feet wide and 24 feet long. Typically, there were only 2 rooms, a living room and a bedroom. The exterior walls were punctured by windows and doors as needed. But these openings were small in size and fitted with wooden shutters, which were the only material in the house which did not come directly from the natural environment. Cooking was done outside, African fashion, over a coal pot. The wattle house is a universal type of folk architecture that could literally be built anywhere suitable materials were available. Examples of it may be found as far-ranging as from Denmark to Africa. The style and technique for weaving the wattle, however, varies from culture to culture. The house type found in the Virgin Islands corresponded closely to a common house form on the west coast of Africa in the vicinity of Danish slaving forts. Thus, the earliest domestic architecture of the Virgin Islands can be considered folk architecture. That is, the structures were built, often communally, by the people who were to inhabit them, using materials found in the local environment and knowledge passed on by oral traditions. Examples of this tradition can be seen in this print of Mary's Fancy Plantation in St. Croix, showing early slave villages containing rectangular wattle and daub houses with thatched roofs clustered together in an irregular pattern reminiscent of an African tribal village. As the plantations began to prosper and the planters began more ambitious building programs, the dwellings of the workers began to improve. Out of a combination of paternalism and self-interest, the planters on many estates started regulating the housing of their slaves. By the middle of the 19th century, Afro-West Indian housing on the plantations was being shaped more by European rather than Afro-West Indian traditions. 2 major changes resulted from this European cultural intrusion. First, the irregularly clustered slave villages began to be reorganized into a uniform pattern corresponding to a European rather than an African sense of spatial order. Houses were neatly laid out in parallel rows, divided by wide lanes, as shown in this 19th century plan of the Bethlehem plantation on St. Croix. Secondly, daub and wattle houses began to be replaced by sturdier stone cottages. These stone houses were constructed of a mixture of local stone, coral, and imported brick. They were built by plantation craftsmen who had acquired the technology by working on the plantation great houses and sugar works, and then translated these skills back into the construction of their own dwellings. At Annaberg Plantation on St. John, elements of African technology were employed in the construction of many of the stone cottages. Inspection of cottage ruins reveals that the post and wattle framework was retained, but stones were used instead of daub. Interesting to note that these dwellings were almost exactly the same size as Mr. James's wattle house in Coral Bay. Afro-West Indian domestic architecture began to change as freedmen made their way from the plantations to the port towns of Charlotte Amalie on St. Thomas and Frederickstead and Christiansted on St. Croix. In these urban settings, they were free to build their own dwellings. The earliest 18th century urban houses probably resembled those of Europe and America. This 1734 map of St. Thomas shows a construction technique common to Northern Europe. Some may even have been prefabricated imports. One newspaper advertisement in the St. Thomas Tidend of 1830 advertised such prefabs from Boston. Gradually, however, the cottages were modified to meet the conditions of the tropical environment. The basic two-room rectangular wooden cottage began to evolve. It was raised off the ground on stone foundation walls. This served to prevent flooding in the rainy season and helped keep it cool by allowing air to circulate underneath. In commercial areas, these stone walls were sometimes carried to the full height of the first floor, and a wooden cottage built above on the second story. The lower floor was then used either as a storeroom or shop. Raising the cottage off the ground also served to protect the structure from the ever-present termites. Porches and galleries were added to protect the walls from the sun and the rain. Windows were often left open without glass panes, but utilizing louvered wooden shutters on the interior. When these shutters were closed, the movable louvers provided ventilation and still allowed the occupants to maintain privacy. The windows were protected on the exterior with strong wooden hurricane shutters. Hurricanes have always been a major threat to the islands. Between 1837 and 1937, the Virgin Islands experienced 11 major storms. To minimize resistance to these devastating winds, the eaves of the roofs did not extend past the walls. Porches and gallery roofs were generally constructed so that if they were blown off, they would not take the whole roof with them. The main wooden structural timbers of the walls and roof were fastened together with a mortise and tenon joint. This simple joint was exceedingly strong. In one end of a timber to be joined, a tongue or tenon was made which would be fitted into a mortise or rectangular hole carved in the other piece. These two pieces were held together with a wooden peg set in an offset peg hole which allowed the joint to be drawn tight as the peg was driven home. This photograph of the 1916 hurricane in St. Croix shows a wooden cottage left completely intact, having resisted a wind strong enough to overturn it and move another house off of its foundation. By the middle of the 18th century, the city of Charlotte Amalie had become a hustling, bustling trading port. As the town grew, it became necessary to survey and lay out new sections to house the growing free-colored population. In 1765, a flat valley just west of Denmark Hill called Savanne was established. By 1837, Savannah contained over 300 buildings packed tightly together on narrow streets and lanes. Many of the poorer newcomers were crowded into long wooden row houses which were built expressly for this purpose.
My name is Bob DeYoung. I'm an architect. I was born very, very close to here in Savannah, and I continue to be very interested in the development and the history of the architecture of the area. This individual structure is a small version of what is known as the Long Row. It is a building that is intended to house 2 apartments, but there are other examples that contain 6, 7, or 8 units. It's built right on the street with the communal spaces to the rear. At the end of the slavery period, the individual lots were re-subdivided and cut in half. This extremely small lot size became the major constraint in the development of the Savannah house. The people were extremely poor and could only afford to do a very bare, basic type of structure. As funds became available, the houses were added to, and these series of additions started to generate the form that is now characteristic of the Savannah house. The units were basically just sleeping rooms, and most of the other household and social activities took place outside, in a yard, in a more communal type of setting. For instance, there could be as many as 5 or 6 houses surrounding a courtyard, which would then house all of the other activities. Cooking was done in one central oven, or if that oven were occupied, a series of stoves or coal pots could be set up for cooking. Washing and clothes drying would be another outdoor type of activity that could take place in the yard, and clotheslines were often utilized by many different families. Styles that became an outgrowth of the Savannah house have had quite a large influence on new construction that has taken place. But we have to remember that the Savannah house, to many people, represented something that they oftentimes wanted to get away from. It represented a period of poverty, of being downtrodden, and certain materials, in this case wood, became characteristic and reminiscent of this. And you find that people moving away from the area oftentimes wanted to get away from some of the other characteristics of the area. And most times wooden structures would not be built by persons moving away from Savannah. Maybe it's because the material itself is too reminiscent of the period. Many of the houses in the Savannah area that were built of wood are still in basically sound structural shape and have quite a bit of future left. Many of them can and should be converted to up-to-date modern uses.
It is in Frederiksted, St. Croix that we find some of the most unique forms of vernacular architecture in the Virgin Islands. Although it was laid out in the 1750s in a classic European grid pattern featuring wide boulevards, Frederiksted has always been intimately associated with and shaped by the social and cultural history of its Afro-West Indian inhabitants. The fire burn, a major labor insurrection in 1878, destroyed much of the European commercial and residential district. After the fire, many plantation laborers moved into town, building houses and small shops, and thus recreating the town in their own image. Today, Frederiksted appears much the same as it did in the late 19th century. It is, consequently, the only town in the Virgin Islands shaped as much by the Afro-West Indian as European urban aesthetics.
My name is Robert Brown. I'm the curator at Fort Frederick Museum in Frederiksted. And we're in Frederiksted now to take a look at some of the architecture of the town. The one that we're standing in front of now is called Victoria House. And it's rather easy to see why it's been called Victoria House, since it has all of the gingerbread and the fancy work that we normally associate with Victorian architecture. Here we have another house in Frederiksted. This is on the corner of Hospital Street and Hill Street, Market Street rather. It very typical of the houses in Frederiksted, a masonry base, ground floor, and a timber second story with a gallery on two sides. The fretwork is typical of Frederiksted, and the man who owns the house says he built it with his father about 1920. The fretwork was probably done with the saw that the man now owns. He's a very proud owner of an 1880 jigsaw, which works by foot power. It whips up and down and does very good work. He prefers it to his electric saws. I would imagine, since he did much of the building throughout the town, that a lot of the fancy work we've seen was cut with that saw. Down below you see a type of entrance to the second story, very much used in Frederiksted, usually rising from the sidewalk as this one does, and enclosed with the doors down below. And this would lead you up onto the gallery above, or at times that gallery is enclosed and you would then be inside the house. Most of them do come up on an open gallery though. What we're looking at is one of the many